probably seen a lot of talk about law and order in the past few years, but especially in the past few weeks. If you break down the phrase law and order, it probably doesn't sound particularly alarming. But actually, it's coded white supremacy. I'm Kara Zelaya from Daily Kos, and this is How Did We Get Here? So, how did we get here? In the history of the United States, the phrase law and order rose to major national prominence during Richard Nixon's 1968 campaign. This phrase was designed to appeal to white voters who were angry about integration and uncomfortable and upset about the riots and protests that broke out as a result of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Law and order is one of those buzzy catchphrases that folks will insist are just two words joined together with literal definitions. But no, etymology matters. Etymology is the study of the origin of words and the ways in which their meaning has changed over time throughout history. Speaking of history, Nixon has such a long one of being a racist. Josh Seitz published an article in July of 2016 titled, "How Trump is Recycling Nixon's Law and Order Playbook." He says, as president, Nixon focused intensely on law and order themes, which is hilarious because Watergate, subtly tapping into the fears of white Southerners, as well as many working-class white Northerners, who associated the rise in crime with urban riots specifically, and African Americans more generally. Nixon recognized this connection when he privately reviewed one of his campaign's television ads in 1972, and remarked, "This hits it right on the nose. It's all about law and order and Christ." But let's get real. I'm not naive, and Watergate Nixon is no one's political darling. So let's talk Reagan. Ronald Reagan and California Republicans were already using that same phrase with the same intent before Nixon brought it nationwide in his 68 campaign. And where had Reagan heard that phrase before? From a 1953 film that he starred in. What a fucking egomaniac. It's also super well documented how super racist Reagan was. Just to throw in some white supremacist flair, here's Reagan on the phone with Nixon in 1971. Just a heads up, this is super upsetting stuff.
President Richard Nixon recorded himself talking to then California Governor Ronald Reagan in October 1971, the day after the United Nations voted to recognize the People's Republic of China. Reagan had phoned Nixon at the White House to vent his frustration at African delegates who celebrated the vote.
Last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did. Yeah. To see those monkeys from those African countries. Damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
How do people still like Ronald Reagan? But let's back it up even more and talk about Goldwater and the Southern strategy. This other bigot, Barry Goldwater, ran on his vote against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He was proud of that. As it turns out, when you're that blatantly racist, sometimes it blows up in your face, or at least it used to, maybe, once in a while. He won 5 Deep South states, his home state of Arizona, and nothing else. The GOP realized that they needed to do more subtle racist appeals in order to win, and they ran Nixon 4 years later with the coded messages, law and order. But don't take my word for it. Legendary Republican consultant Lee Atwater was working in Ronald Reagan's White House, and you can hear him talk about this in his own words. This one's a super warning. You're gonna hear the N-word rapid fire.
Is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
This silent majority of white Southerners that the candidate knew that they needed to attract in order to win understood that Nixon's call for law and order was the same as Goldwater's. And realizing that already in the 60s it was beginning to be a social faux pas to be completely blatantly racist, they could hide those racial fears, by which we mean fear of black people, behind saying things like they supported law and order. And then instead of saying that they had racial fears, they were saying that they feared for their safety, and then later for the economy. And we hear that today, all the time. And that's because whether it was blatant or subconscious, many voters wanted an economy that was built on the backs of black people who to this day do not get their fair share of benefits from. And all of this is one of the big reasons that the South is still considered in many ways Republican territory, because the GOP continues to run these narratives and these candidates that do coded appeals to people who are racist or have really deep-rooted implicit bias, whether they can admit that to themselves or not. So the next time you hear the phrase law and order, perk up those ears. And remember, this phrase has a long history of hatred and bigotry attached to it. So let me know in the comments, did you know about this? Are there any other phrases that you're hearing a lot now that you're like, could that be something else? If you found this super valuable, please be sure to hit the like button and share this with anyone who you'd like to educate on the subject. Have a good one.